My husband demanded a DNA test for our son, then his mother accidentally exposed a 30-year family secret. My husband looked me in the eye after 7 years of marriage and told me he needed a DNA test for our son. 3 weeks later, his mother was sitting at my kitchen table, crying in a way I had never seen a grown woman cry. Because the results had started a chain of questions nobody in that family had been prepared to answer for 30 years. My name is Lauren. I'm 33 years old. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, went to the University of Tennessee for undergrad, moved to Nashville after graduation, and have lived there ever since. I work in healthcare administration at a regional hospital network, which means I spend most of my professional life managing documentation, compliance, and the paper trail that holds large institutions together. The irony of what happened inside my own marriage is something I've thought about more times than I can count. I've been with my husband Colt for 9 years total, married for 7. We have a son named Mason who just turned 5 and who has, without question, the most opinions of any kindergartner I have ever personally encountered. I want to be careful with this story because some of it is still tender and some of it involves people who never asked for any of it. But I've been carrying it for close to a year and I think it needs to be the beginning. Colt and I met in Nashville through mutual friends at a backyard cookout the summer after I moved there. He was in construction project management. Solid, steady, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and remembered what you told him 3 weeks later. We dated for 2 years before getting engaged, another year before the wedding. We were not impulsive people. We talked about money before we combined it. We talked about kids before we tried for them. We did premarital counseling at our church not because anyone made us, but because we both wanted to go in with our eyes open. I tell you all of that because I want you to understand that what happened didn't happen inside a careless marriage. It happened inside a careful one, which almost made it worse. We tried for Mason for about 14 months. There was one miscarriage early on, around 8 weeks, which we didn't tell anyone about except my mom and Colt's parents. After that, we just kept trying and tried not to make it feel clinical and mostly failed at that second part. When I finally made it past 12 weeks, I remember standing in the bathroom with the ultrasound photo in my hand feeling like I'd been holding my breath for over a year. Mason was born in April. He was healthy and loud and had a full head of dark hair, and Colt cried in the delivery room, which I didn't expect and which I will remember for the rest of my life. The first 2 years were hard in the normal ways. Sleep deprivation, adjusting, figuring out who we each were now that there was a third person we were responsible for. We got through it together, not without friction but genuinely together. Then Mason turned 3 and started looking more like himself. What I mean is that the vague baby features started settling into something specific and distinct. His hair lightened as he got older, going from that dark newborn color to a warm medium brown with natural highlights that people always commented on. His eyes, which had been dark in infancy, shifted into a clear gray-green that I'd never seen on either side of our families. At 3, his face started organizing itself. Wide forehead, a strong jaw already showing, freckles across his nose that came out every summer. He looked like himself. He looked like my son. I did not think anything beyond that. Colt apparently did. I didn't know that. That's the part I come back to most. He was turning something over in his head for months and said nothing. He got quieter in a way I attributed to a difficult stretch at work. He was somewhere else sometimes when we were in the same room, and I read it as exhaustion. I gave him space because we'd always given each other space to work through things. I did not know what he was working through was whether I had been faithful to him. The conversation happened on a Wednesday night in October. Mason was at Colt's parents' house for the night. We'd had dinner and I was loading the dishwasher and Colt was still at the kitchen table not doing anything, just sitting, and he said my name in a tone that made me close the dishwasher and turn around. He said he needed to ask me something and he needed me to hear him out before I responded. I said okay. He said he wanted a DNA test for Mason. I stood there for a moment. I said, "What did you just say?" He said he wasn't accusing me of anything. He said he just needed to know. He said Mason's coloring had been eating at him, the gray-green eyes, the way his features had come in, and he knew it was probably nothing, but he couldn't stop thinking about it, and it was getting in the way, and he needed it resolved. He needed it resolved, like it was a scheduling conflict. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it was more than one thing at once. There was hurt that was immediate and physical, like something slamming shut in my chest. There was anger behind it, building. And underneath both of those, there was something that felt like the floor shifting, because the person standing across from me had been my partner for 9 years, and he was looking at me like I was a question he needed answered. I said, "You're asking me if I cheated on you." He said, "I'm asking for a test." I said, "Colt, that is the same thing." He didn't respond to that. I sat down. I asked him to tell me what he actually believed, not the carefully worded version. What did he actually think had happened? He said he didn't know. He said that was why he needed the test. I said, "In 9 years together, have I ever done one thing that gave you a reason to think I was capable of that?" He said no. I said, "Then where is this coming from?" He said, "I don't know. It's just there and I can't make it stop." I've turned that sentence over 100 times. It was honest. And I almost wished he'd been less honest, because at least a specific accusation would have given me something to push back against. I agreed to the test, not because I had 1 second of doubt about what it would show. I agreed because I wanted documentation. I wanted a result that said what I already knew, in writing, and I wanted Colt to have to look at it and sit with the fact that he'd needed it. We ordered a home kit, 5 to 7 business days. Those days were quiet in the specific way a house goes quiet when two people are thinking about the same thing and not saying it. We were polite, we functioned. We picked Mason up from his grandparents and made dinner and gave him a bath and read him stories and then sat in the same living room not talking about the only thing either of us was thinking about. Mason came home from Colt's parents with a drawing of what he said was a race car, but which looked more like an oval with mismatched wheels. He was enormously proud of it. I put it on the refrigerator and held him a little longer than usual when I put him to bed. The results came on a Monday, 99.997% probability of paternity. I forwarded the email to Colt without writing a single word above it. He came to find me in the bedroom about 15 minutes later. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been wrong and he was sorry. He looked ashamed in a way I thought was appropriate. I said, I need you to understand what you actually did. He said he understood. I said, you didn't just hurt me. You spent months looking at our son and letting a doubt sit in your head that had no basis. Mason didn't do anything to deserve that. He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. We got through the next few months the hard way. We went back to our marriage counselor, a woman named Dr. Renee Holt, who we'd seen twice during the fertility process, and Colt worked through whatever had seeded that doubt in him. I was not perfectly gracious through those months. There were days I looked at him across the dinner table and felt something close to contempt and had to figure out what to do with it. I didn't always handle it well, but we were trying. That matters. And then about 2 months after the results came back, we were at his parents' house for Sunday dinner and his mother said something that cracked the floor open under everyone. I need to tell you about Deborah. Deborah Pruitt is 60 years old. She has been married to Colt's father, Gary, for 36 years. She is a warm woman, organized, the kind of person who always has a casserole in the freezer for someone going through something and who remembers every birthday without prompting. She had been nothing but kind to me for 9 years. She called me her daughter-in-law in a tone that sounded like something she was proud of. She had opinions, sometimes sharp ones, but she always delivered them to my face and never behind my back, which I respected. She had also, it turned out, been carrying something for 30 years. The Sunday dinner was ordinary. Gary was talking about a drainage problem in the backyard he'd been putting off. Deborah was serving. Mason was conducting negotiations about whether mashed potatoes counted as a vegetable. Colt's younger sister Amber was there with her husband Dale. At some point, the conversation drifted to family resemblance the way it does at family dinners. Amber said Mason had Colt's build, even at 5. Already wide through the shoulders. People agreed. Someone mentioned Mason's freckles coming from my side. Normal dinner talk. And then Gary said, offhandedly, that Mason had his grandfather's eyes, meaning Gary's own father who had passed about 10 years earlier, the gray-green. He said old Earl had those exact same eyes and wasn't that something, and Deborah went very still. Not dramatically. Just for a second or two, she stopped reaching for the rolls and her face did something I couldn't fully read, and then she picked up the bread basket, moved it, and said she needed to check on something in the kitchen. I noticed it. I'm not entirely sure why I caught it when nobody else seemed to. Maybe because I'd spent the previous 2 months finely tuned to the things people weren't saying. Maybe because 9 years in hospital administration had trained me to notice when someone's behavior didn't match what they were presenting. I filed it and said nothing. The rest of dinner was fine. Mason's mashed potatoes counted as a vegetable through sheer persistence. Gary fell asleep in his recliner before the game ended. Normal Sunday. On the drive home, I asked Colt if he'd noticed his mom's face when his dad mentioned Earl's eyes. Colt said he hadn't really been paying attention. I said she'd gone still for a moment. He said she was probably just tired. I said maybe and let it go. 3 weeks later, Deborah called me. Not Colt, me specifically. She asked if she could come by one afternoon when Colt was at work. She said she had something she needed to talk through and she wasn't ready to talk to her son about it yet. She needed to say it out loud to another person first. I said of course. I didn't ask what it was. Her voice told me enough that I didn't think I should ask over the phone. She came on a Thursday afternoon. Mason was at preschool. I made coffee. She sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her mug and looked out the window for a long moment before she started talking. She said, "That DNA test Colt did." I said yes. She said, "When he told me about it, something moved in me that I told myself was nothing." I kept telling myself that. I waited. She said, "Colt is Gary's son. I want you to hear that first before anything else. He is." But there was a period before I married Gary when I was also seeing someone else. She stopped and pulled in a breath. She said, "It was maybe 3 months where things overlapped toward the end when I was already with Gary but hadn't fully let go of the other situation. And when I found out I was pregnant with Colt, the timing was close enough that I did the math and told myself it was fine. I believed that. I genuinely believed it for 30 years. The kitchen was quiet. I said carefully, "Deborah, are you saying you weren't certain?" She looked at me directly. Her eyes were wet. Gary never knew any of it. I ended things, chose Gary, and never looked back and never regretted it for a single day. But when that test came back at 997%, I could not stop thinking about how that number works, about what a test like that would have shown if someone had run one on me and Gary. Back then. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I sat with that for a long moment. I said, "Have you ever done a test?" She said, "No." I said, "Do you want to?" She said, "I don't know. That's why I'm here. Because I can't tell Gary. I can't tell Colt. And I didn't know where else to go with it." I've thought many times since then about why she came to me specifically. Not her closest friend from church, not her sister up in Chattanooga, her daughter-in-law. I think it was because she'd watched me go through something humiliating and come out of it with my back straight, and she decided I was someone who could hold a hard thing without dropping it. I think she needed to believe she was right about that. I told her I was glad she called. I also told her as gently as I could that at some point she was going to need to tell Colt. She closed her eyes. I said, "Not today, but eventually," because Colt asked our son for a DNA test without a single piece of evidence. If there is an actual reason sitting somewhere in his own history, he deserves to know that. She said, "This could take apart my marriage." I said, "I know," she said. "Gary is a good man." I said, "I know he is," she cried then, not holding it back, just steadily. The way people cry when they've carried something until the exit was out. I sat with her. I didn't tell her what to do beyond what I'd already said. She hugged me long at the door when she left. She said, "I'm sorry for what Colt put you through." I said, "We're working on it." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The symmetry of it kept turning in my head. Colt had demanded proof from me with no evidence, no history, nothing but a feeling he couldn't name. And sitting inside his own family was an actual question, a real one, present for 30 years that nobody had ever thought to ask. He had gone looking for dishonesty in the wrong place entirely. I didn't tell him right away. Deborah had asked for time, and I owed her that. But I also couldn't carry something that heavy while we were still trying to repair what had broken between us. I told Dr. Holt in our next session without names or identifying details. I said that information had come to me that connected to Colt's family history, and I was trying to figure out how to hold it. Dr. Holt said, "Is it yours to carry?" I said, "No." She said, "Then the question isn't what you do with it. The question is when you stop holding it for someone else." Deborah called me again about 10 days later. She said she hadn't slept properly since we'd talked. She'd made a decision. She wanted to do the test herself, quietly, before saying anything to anyone. She needed to know the answer before she could figure out what came next. I said that made sense. She said, "Will you help me? I'm afraid if I try to do it alone, I'll lose my nerve." I ordered the kit to my address. I brought it to her on a Saturday morning when Gary was out at his buddy's place. We sat at her kitchen table, and I walked her through the steps, and she did the swab herself and sealed it herself, and I mailed it on my way home. I'm not holding that up as the right way to handle things. I was working with what I had and trying to cause the least damage I could to the most people. Sometimes that's the only framework you've got. The results took 7 days. Deborah called me the morning they came. She didn't say anything right away when I picked up. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "Gary is his father." I exhaled. She said 99. 98%. I said, "Deborah." She started crying again, but it was different from the last time. Relief has a different sound than grief. "I know both now," she said. 30 years. I carried this for 30 years and there was nothing there. I said, "The fear was still real, even if what you were afraid of wasn't." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I still have to tell him." I said, "You don't have to legally." She said, "I know that, but I kept something from my husband that he had a right to know about, even if the answer came back fine. He deserved to know there was a question." I didn't argue with her. She was right, and she'd gotten there herself. She told Gary 2 days later. I found out from Colt, who found out because Gary called him, which was not the order I would have chosen, but by that point the information was moving and we were all just trying to stay upright inside it. Colt came home from that call looking like he'd had the wind knocked out of him. Not angry, just hollowed out somehow, like the ground had shifted and he was trying to find where it had settled. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd asked me for the test months before, and he said, "My mom was seeing someone else when she got pregnant with me." I said, "I know." He looked at me. I said, "She came to me first. She needed to say it to someone before she could say it to anyone in the family. I've known for about 3 weeks. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner." He sat with that. Then he said, "The test came back okay." I said, "Gary is your father." "Yes." He nodded slowly, rubbed the back of his neck the way he does when he's trying to reorder something. Then he said, "She carried that her whole life." I said yes. He said, "Since before I was born." I said yes. Mason was in the other room watching something, laughing at whatever it was. The ordinary sound of a 5-year-old who had no idea that 30 feet away the adults in his life were trying to find solid ground. Then Colt said, "She was more careful with it than I was." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "She had something real. She had an actual reason to be uncertain, and she worked through it privately, and she didn't put it on anyone else. I had nothing. I had zero basis, and I still made it your problem." He looked at the table. He said, "My mom carried 30 years of a real reason and handled it with more dignity than I showed you over something I invented in my own head." I let that sit without filling the silence. He said, "Lauren, I'm sorry. I said it before and I meant it, but I mean it differently right now." There is a way an apology sounds when the person saying it finally understands what they're apologizing for. It lands somewhere different. He'd been sorry before because he'd been proven wrong. Now he was sorry because he understood the shape of what he'd actually done to me. That distinction is the reason I stayed. Gary surprised me more than anyone. Deborah told me he'd gone quiet for almost a full day after she told him. Just went inside himself in that way quiet men do. Then he came downstairs and sat across from her and said, "Did you love him?" She said no. She said she'd ended it and chosen Gary and had never once wished it had gone any other way. He said, "Then I don't know what you need me to do with this." She said she just needed him to know. That she'd kept something from him and he deserved to know it even if the outcome was the same. Gary had looked at her a long moment and then said, "Deborah, I've known since our second date that you were the kind of woman men didn't let go of easy. That was never news. What I know is you stayed. That's all I ever needed." I cried when she told me that. I can't fully explain why, but I cried. The 30 years kept sitting with me. Deborah had lived inside a fear for 3 decades, a fear that turned out to be nothing, a fear a single test could have answered at any point, but that she'd carried in silence because the stakes felt too large to examine. And her son had inherited that same instinct, to hold fear quietly until it became unbearable, but he'd turned it outward instead of in. He'd let his doubt build for months and then aimed it at me. Understanding that didn't excuse what he did. But it let me stop reading it as a verdict on our marriage and start seeing it as a pattern that could be interrupted. Because Colt grew up in a house where the hard things were processed privately. You worked through your fears before bringing them to anyone. That's not always wrong. But when his doubt grew past what he could hold alone, it came out sideways. It came out aimed at the person he should have been talking to from the beginning. Deborah and I became closer through all of it in a way I didn't see coming. We'd been close before in the way a good daughter-in-law and a warm mother-in-law are close. After this, we were close in a different way. We'd sat across from each other in the hard part of things. We knew what the other one looked like when she was scared and when she was relieved and when she was trying to hold herself together for someone else. She came over to help me replant the flower beds along the front walk in April. We didn't talk about any of it. We just dug in the dirt, and she told me which flowers did better in afternoon shade, and I told her about a situation at work, and she gave me advice I've used several times since. Mason came outside with a worm he'd found and presented it to her like a gift. She pretended to be as excited about it as he was, which is a form of love I have a lot of respect for. Colt and Gary went to a Titans game that same month, came home loud and disagreeing about the fourth quarter. Everything on the surface looked almost exactly like it had before. Almost. The difference is that now we know things we didn't know. Gary knows there was a choice and Deborah made it toward him. Colt knows that fear inside a family doesn't disappear. It just finds the next container, and I know that the man I married is capable of failing me in a specific and serious way, and also capable of seeing that failure fully without shrinking it. That second part is what I decided to stay for, Doctor. Holt said in one of our last sessions that after something like this, the question isn't whether it happened. It did happen. The question is whether both people can stay honest about it going forward, honest enough that it doesn't repeat itself in some new form. We're still doing that work. I don't know that it ever fully finishes. Mason has no idea any of this occurred. He is 5. He negotiates aggressively about bedtime and has strong opinions about which dinosaur is the best dinosaur and has those gray-green eyes that came from somewhere none of us can fully account for, some branch of some family tree that genetics doesn't map cleanly. He looks like himself. He looks like my son. I watch him sometimes and think about the chain of it. Deborah at 27 making a choice and deciding to carry it alone forever. Gary at 30 saying the choosing was what mattered. Colt sitting at that kitchen table needing proof of something that was never in question. Me standing at the dishwasher the night everything shifted. All of it running through this one person who found a worm in the garden and treated it like a miracle. He fell asleep in the car on the way home from his grandparents' house last Sunday, head against the window, completely out, the way kids sleep when they feel all the way safe. I looked at him in the rearview mirror for a moment. That's where things are. Not the end of anything, just where we are right now.